and welcome to second semester of U.S. History. And we're going to start out with lesson 1.02 called Cities Grow. The opening of the Chicago's World Fair in 1893 signaled the end of a start of a new era. More than recovery from a fire, it celebrated Columbus's arrival in the New World while generating a new world of ideas about urban life. Transportation innovations like ferries, trolleys, and cable cars added to the transformation of cities as population grew and more land was annexed. But population increases also meant social shifts, class stratification, and slums as crimes, disease, and overcrowding raised new challenges. How would the cities cope? And goals for today's lesson. Describe the impact of the transportation revolution on the growth of cities and suburbs in the late 1800s. Recognize the elements of urban social stratification in the cities of the late 1800s and explain the philosophy of social Darwinism. And don't forget to go to lesson resources and find your reading guide and the lesson answer key so you can check your answers at the end. And we will begin. Daily checklist. We're going to start by reading pages 538 through 551. That's a long reading today. Let me write that down. 538, 551. Okay, let's get started. So here we are in our textbook. Let's turn the page. Do we get to the actual content? And birth of the modern American city. On the evening of Sunday, October 8th, 1871, a fire broke out on the west side of Chicago in a barn owned by Mr. and Mrs. Patrick and Catherine O'Leary, Mrs. O'Leary's cow. It was later rumored that the O'Leary's cow had kicked over a lantern, but this could never be confirmed. Whatever the cause, the fire spread quickly. The city was dry from a lack of rain. Strong winds drove the flames into the heart of the city. Firefighters, exhausted from battling a major blaze a day earlier, were now slow to respond. Resident recalled, it was like a snowstorm, only the flakes were red instead of white. The fire destroyed the city's water pumping station, the offices of the Chicago Tribune, people's homes and businesses, and entire city blocks. By the time it was over, many of the city's streets lay in ruins. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 left some 300 people dead and 100,000 homeless. Some thought the city would never recover. Yet within 20 years, the citizens of Chicago rebuilt their ravaged city, transforming it into a center of economic power and architectural splendor. To celebrate the city's rebirth, Chicago hosted a World's Fair in 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition, as it was officially known, to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of Columbus in the New World, covered more than 600 acres. A section known as the White City featured imposing new buildings in classical style with modern features presented as a model of clean, safe, orderly urban living. Visitors crowded into displays of science, industry, international exhibits from dozens of countries, and a separate area for amusements that included magicians, dancers, and singers. On the world's first Ferris wheel, riders could glimpse the city's sweeping landscape from towering heights. Close to 26 million visitors at the Chicago's World Fair celebrated not just the revival of a single city, but also the promise of modern urban life. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed the rapid growth of not only Chicago but many American cities. While most Americans in 1860 still lived on farms or in small towns, by 1920 a majority lived in urban areas. In reality, American cities were not like the shining white city of the Chicago World's Fair. America's growing cities faced daunting challenges of poverty, crime, and disorder. As American cities grew, their populations separated along the lines of class, race, and ethnicity. At the same time, the city afforded new opportunities for culture and leisure. As transportation improved, cities expanded and changed in character. As the great cities grew and changed, they forever changed the face of the United States. And just in case you are at all interested about the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the World's Fair, there's this really interesting book I read about it. It's a nonfiction book, but it's written like it's fiction. It's called Devil in the White City, and it deals with the building of the World's Fair, and then also some not so savory things that were happening in Chicago at the time, hence the devil part, the Devil in the White City. So just throwing that out there. It's a pretty interesting book. But back to the reading. From walking city to metropolis. In the early and mid-19th century, most urban areas of the United States were walking cities, in which residents could mostly get where they needed to go on foot. In these tight and compact cities, residents from different social classes lived and worked in the same neighborhoods. But to the mid to late 19th century, as urban population swelled, cities needed more space for new residents and businesses. New forms of mass transportation began to transform the nature of urban America, making it possible for more city dwellers to live farther from their places of work. In the greater New York area, steam ferries carried some 33 million people between neighborhoods. Most people travel back and forth from Manhattan to Brooklyn, New York, or to Hoboken, New Jersey. Observing the press of people on the ferry docks in the 19th century Brooklyn, poet Walt Whitman noted crowds of men and women attired in the usual costumes. On the ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds that crossed returning home. In the 1850s, New York's ferry crossing cost just 2 cents a day, making it affordable for tens of thousands of local residents. By 1870, the ferries carried some 50 million people each year between Brooklyn and New York City. They made Brooklyn's quick rise as a city possible. At the dawn of the 20th century, Brooklyn had iron mills and hat factories, meatpacking plants and grain depots, and more than 350,000 foreign-born residents. New York also afforded residents access to hundreds of miles of omnibus and streetcar lines. Omnibuses were horse-drawn buses that made regularly scheduled stops. The first streetcars, known as horse cars, were pulled by horses, but their metal wheels ran on rails, making it for a smoother ride at twice the speed of the omnibus. By 1860, 45 million people were using New York's horse-drawn streetcars. In the same year, Philadelphia had 155 miles of streetcar rails. The horses, however, polluted the streets with manure and were themselves overworked and subject to disease. And here's a map of emerging cities in the 1870s. As you can see, the green are the lesser populated areas. The yellow is 20 to 40%, the orange 40 to 60%, and the red was 60% or more people lived in cities. So it looks like only Massachusetts at that time, but there were several other very important growing areas there as well. City dwellers soon had an alternative to the horse-drawn streetcar with the invention of the elevated railroad, or the L for short. On the L, steam-powered cars moved on tracks mounted on high pillars. While elevated trains moved quickly, they shook nearby buildings and rained ashes on pedestrians. And the tracks, about 3 stories high, blocked the sunlight from streets below. The next major step in urban transportation was the invention of the cable car. Huge underground steam engines continuously pulled the heavy cable accessible through a slot in the street. To make the cable car go forward, the operator engaged a device that gripped the moving cable. By 1894, Chicago had 86 miles of cable car track to carry city dwellers between home and work. At their peak in 1890, cable car systems were carrying more than 370 million passengers back and forth across American cities each year. And here's a map of rapid urbanization. The greatest improvements in transportation for urban Americans came with advances in electrification. Frank Sprague, a former colleague of Thomas Edison's, invented a spring-loaded trolley pole that allowed streetcars to draw electricity from overhead wires. In Richmond, Virginia, in the late 1880s, Sprague set up the first successful electric streetcar system. Electric streetcars, or trolleys, were faster than horse cars and cable cars, produced less pollution, were easier to maintain, and cost the average passenger just a nickel. Other advances in electrical systems made possible the development of North America's first subway, which opened in Boston in 1897. As new forms of transportation freed people from the need to walk to work, many middle-class and wealthy residents began to move to suburbs, residential areas on the outskirts of cities. Commuter rail lines like the Long Island Railroad enabled people to travel quickly from offices in cities to homes in the suburbs. Although ferries shuttled millions of passengers between Manhattan and Brooklyn each year, strong currents made the crossing difficult. In the winter of 1866 to 67, parts of the East River froze, making passage all but impossible. Hoping to connect their city more closely with Manhattan, Brooklyn's leaders hired John Augustus Roebling to build a bridge across the river. An immigrant from Germany, Roebling designed a massive suspension bridge tall enough to allow passengers to sail ships and long enough to escape the river's strong currents. While taking measurements for the bridge in 1869, Roebling had an accident and died. His son, Washington Roebling, took over the project and supervised a crew of thousands of skilled and unskilled workers. Painstakingly, the bridge team bore into the muddy banks of the East River, digging at a rate of just 6 inches per week. until they reached a layer of stable bedrock to which to mount the piers. They constructed massive towers on each side of the river, connected by an intricate string of steel cables. The result, a beautiful mile-long structure, was the world's longest suspension bridge, strong enough to support 2 elevated rail lines, 2 carriage lanes, and a pedestrian path. The bridge officially opened in 1883. With Manhattan and Brooklyn connected, the scene was set for a merger of the two cities. The Brooklyn Bridge helped create modern New York City. But let's go back up and read about the bicycle. This is pretty interesting. By the 1890s, a series of innovations had made bicycles safer and more comfortable. The most important changes were wheels of equal size instead of a huge front wheel and a tiny rear wheel, a chain-driven rear wheel, and the replacement of solid rubber tires with pneumatic, air-filled tires. Mass production made the new improved bicycles widely available and affordable for the middle class. In 1899, more than 1 million bicycles were manufactured in the United States. By 1900, bicycles were important for both transportation and recreation. And this is what I find really interesting. Cycling became especially popular among women. Some women saw cycling as not merely transportation, but a statement of freedom. Susan B. Anthony, a leader of the women's rights movement, said that bicycling has done more to emancipate women than any one thing in the world. It gives her a feeling of self-reliance and independence the moment she takes her seat. The feeling of freedom might have been related to the clothing best suited to riding a bicycle. Since it was unsafe to ride in the billowy, multi-layered, full-length dresses of the time, many women took to wearing skirts just below the knee with bloomers, a kind of loose trousers beneath. Some people objected to both bloomers and bicycling for women as undignified at best and immoral at worst. But American women cycled by the thousands until the bicycling craze subsided when widely available mass transit and eventually the automobile became available. I always find that really interesting. The lowly bicycle, who knew it had such an important part of the women's rights movement? Back to growth through annexation. New advances in transportation and technology allowed cities to expand by annexing neighboring communities. In 1898, New York, which up to that time consisted only of Manhattan Island, annexed the formerly independent communities of Staten Island, Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. As the old walking city faded into history, the new megacity of New York counted a population of more than 3 million residents. In Baltimore, Maryland, city leaders tripled the city size by incorporating 23 square miles of land north and west of the city. The newly acquired land was quickly transformed into a booming commercial and residential district, including a firehouse, several churches, and a Goucher College for women. Middle-class professionals built homes and prospered in the new district. Social stratification. By the end of the 19th century, large cities had distinct residential, business, and manufacturing districts. City dwellers who once lived in the same place where they worked now more and more often commuted to work by public transportation. Middle-class professionals built homes in the rapidly expanding suburbs and traveled to work each day by train or coach. As American cities grew, they became more stratified, separated by categories such as class, race, and ethnicity. In the mid-1800s, millions of native-born Americans left their farms to the city. Many of the American-born migrants to cities were African Americans. In the late 19th century, great waves of immigration fueled the growth of American cities. By 1910, the major cities north of Baltimore, most of the population consisted of immigrants and their children. Between the 1820s and 1920s, some 36 million people were both pushed and pulled to the United States from Asia, Europe, and Latin America. As cities grew, most residential districts separated along the lines of ethnicity and race. African Americans and white migrants from rural areas formed their own distinct urban communities. Many immigrants remained crowded into tight-knit ethnic communities to shield themselves against the hardships of urban life. By 1919, over 50% of the white men in Chicago's manufacturing sector were foreign-born. The majority of these people came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Laborers tended to settle in communities where they worked. A single ethnic group usually dominated each of the city's neighborhoods. The Bush section of Chicago was home to Polish immigrants. Cheltenham had many German and Swedish immigrants, and Green Bay was predominantly Mexican Americans. Social clubs, neighborhood saloons, and other institutions catered to specific ethnic groups. In Indianapolis, mutual aid societies and fraternal lodges provided Slovenian laborers with a reminder of home life and offered economic aid to fellow countrymen in need. Many immigrant communities, churches, and synagogues help provide the social glue to hold their working class community together. For example, the most important Slovenian institution in Indianapolis was the Holy Trinity Catholic Church. The bonds of ethnicity, however, proved stronger than the bonds of religion. Slovaks and Bohemians had their own churches. In some cities, Irish parishioners refused to allow Italian Catholics to attend their churches and worship at the same Mass. While working class city dwellers tended to divide along ethnic and racial lines, as a whole they were separated